Hello, hello. This is Professor Werwath. I wanted to play with some interesting concepts here, specifically nonlinear growth, nonlinear systems behavior, and specifically also the limits to growth, which was a paper written back in 1972 by some MIT professors. And of course, it's been updated since then. So we'll kind of close with that. And I'll also close with some agent-based modeling. So you'll have a chance to see what this looks like in dynamic systems simulation, which is available here at Northwestern using something called NetLogo. And the NetLogo website is alive and well. You can certainly download this application and try it for yourself. So you could probably wonder, why do I have a chessboard on the first page, right? So if I made a deal with you and I said, look, I'll give you a choice, right? I'll give you $1,000 up front and you can walk away. Or instead, I could put a penny on each square of this chess table or this chess board and double it as I go from one square to the next, right? So doubling that penny from one square to the next, and you can take that cumulative sum of all those pennies home with you, or you can take the $1,000. Which would you choose, right? I think most people would take the $1,000 because it's easier to visualize, it's easier to understand. Exponential growth is not something that the human brain is wired for. If I asked you what you might consider that penny doubling every square on this chess table might be worth, I'm sorry, this chess board, I did the math, and it turns out that it's roughly 1.9 times 10 to the 17th dollars, which is significantly more than $1,000. You would have been far better off taking the penny doubling. And I think maybe mathematicians would have chosen that, but most regular humans who don't really conceptualize the power of exponential growth, how quickly systems can grow from their current state to something dramatically different, and then in many cases collapse, right? That is the nature of nature. That's the nature of biological systems and systems as we know them. Let's look at human population, right? Human population has grown. You can see that the fastest growth of world population was actually back roughly prior to 1980, right? Where we were peaking at something like 2.1, 2.2%. That doesn't mean that the population stopped growing after that. It just meant that it started growing slower, right? So that tremendous spike in terms of population growth, which came as a result of, to some extent, the baby boom and slightly after the baby boom, will result in basically a peak population forecast somewhere between 11 and 12 billion people a little bit after the year 2100. Now that's the world at large, right? But that doesn't show what it looks like country by country. So I decided to put in the upper right countries like India, China, Nigeria, and this is all courtesy of our world in data. So it's, data that they've collected country by country, and they've extrapolated birth rates going, for the next 50 to 80 years. India's and China are basically peaking. India peaking in around 2050, 2060. China's peaking roughly about now. The US never peaks, but it never really grows that dramatically. Brazil peaking in around 2050. Russia and Japan having already peaked somewhere around 2000 or maybe 2005. And Germany, again, peaking in the past tense, as has Italy and Spain. So most of what we consider Western Europe peaked in their population, and they're in decline, right? Vietnam has yet to peak and probably won't peak for another 20 or 30 years. So that's where, at least on this chart, where much of the growth will be, not to mention countries like Nigeria, where significant growth can be expected for many years to come. So why even bring this up? Well, systems dynamics is one of the topics of this talk, right? What does system dynamics boil down to? Identifying a problem, a hypothesis, explaining the cause, creating a structure or a causal graph, augmenting that graph with more information, converting that graph to a system dynamics flow graph, and then translating it into a dynamo program or equations. So if you take that simple S-curve that we saw before and realize that this is the nature of how systems typically operate, systems thinking involves both systems analysis and systems dynamics, right? And this chart basically tries to explain the differences between the two. In analysis, you're creating a model that you're learning from that's driven by a question. In the case of system dynamics, you're creating data to support a test that will inform your model, right? And inform how you populate that model. An example, let me just give you one simple example of system dynamics and that thinking applied to autonomous vehicles. I'm a big EV nut, I'm a big AV nut. Autonomous vehicles is really a function of, if you're trying to understand, for example, the number of vehicle trips in an AV, right? There's a lot of elements that would drive that or influence that. For example, the number of vehicles, the willingness to share a trip with strangers, the comfort, ease, and attractiveness of using AVs, the share and distribution of destinations accessible by AV, the number of households inside that geofenced zone, the population without access to a traditional vehicle. Each of these has a positive or negative impact on the number of trips, okay? If you can do a lot of walking and cycling trips, that will have a negative impact on the number of AV trips, right? If you have, for example, a willingness to share a trip with strangers, that too will have a negative impact on the number of vehicle trips. The share and distribution of accessible AVs will have a positive impact, and the number of households, as that increases, that too has a positive impact. So the denser the area, right, the more likely you'll have AVs, in successful operation, right? So you can see immediately, highly dense urban areas versus rural or suburban areas will have vastly different approaches to autonomous vehicles. This model is really meant to try to understand that kind of behavior, that comes from these various influences. We're all familiar with COVID. I mean, another example might very well be epidemiology, right? And how viral transmission is impacted by the effectiveness of public health risk communications, performance of protected behaviors, perceived number of infectious people, environmental contamination, risk of transmission, et cetera, et cetera. So all of these influences have a positive or negative impact on the variables and on the effects you're trying to demonstrate, right? So this is one mechanism. This actually influenced government policy, both at the state and federal levels, and even local levels, to understand, when to put in certain policies and when to remove them, right? And when was it safe to do so? On the urban dynamics fronts, right, you might ask, for example, boom and bust cycles within new business opportunities within an urban setting, right? So the number of businesses in an urban setting will impact the number of unemployed, which will impact the low-income housing, which will impact land availability, which will eventually limit the growth of land and the number of businesses that you can create. So you can see these feedback loops. You can see the investment loop. You can see the job growth and tax-based loops. These are all interrelated and interdependent. So and these are not performing linearly. That's the point. These are not straight line graphs. This is not your Econ 101 class where you were shown, basically supply and demand curves and price sensitivities following some sort of straight line. The human mind can understand straight line relationships so much easier than we can understand exponential relationships, right? Or these complex systems relationships. How is this being implemented in the real world today? In the real world today, we're building digital twins. This is one of the latest technologies that is hitting the world of engineering and engineering management. What is a digital twin? It's a dynamic model, a simulation of a complex system, plus real-time data informing the state of the system, typically using IoT technology. So prior to IoT, which has only been around for the last, say, 5 or 10 years in any real sense, right? Basically, we have the ability to model in real time complex systems, not just on historical data, but on real-time data. And the real-time data informs the model and adjusts the model in real time and can proactively then create situations where you have a feed-forward loop that says, okay, if you've got a digital twin of an airplane on the ground, Could you use that digital twin to actually fly the plane that's in the air? Will we see pilotless airplanes in the future? Or will they be remotely piloted from the ground using a digital twin? Or will that digital twin be so automated that it won't even have a human being on the ground, but rather telemetry and information from the ground informing the plane and effectively having this digital twin technology creating a closed loop where it's effectively automatically flown from the ground and putting pilots and co-pilots out of business, right? Well, the next commercial airplane you step into, let's say in 2030 or 2040, will it still have a pilot, right? Interesting question. Limits to growth. What is limits to growth, right? Limits to growth, otherwise often abbreviated as LTG, was a 1972 report that came from the discussion and the possibility of having exponential economic and population growth within finite supplies of resources. What are those resources? Fresh water, food, air, pollution, et cetera, et cetera. So the study used what was known at the time as the World Tree Computer Model to simulate the consequence of interactions between the Earth and human systems, right? Jay Forrester of MIT described it in his book, World Dynamics, and it has been updated, I want to say, probably 3 or 4 times since then. So these models were forecasting not just population, right, but also the availability of all the resources that population would need, right? And of course, there's interdependencies between them. The population depletes the resources, but requires the resources to survive, right? So what does this look like, right? If you look at resources, you look at births and deaths and food and services and pollution and industrial output and population, you can see where he was forecasting effectively a population collapse around the world, roughly around 2050 or so, with services and resources and births and to some extent food population, food per capita collapsing, anywhere from say 20 to 30 years before that. So that would be roughly about now, roughly the 2020s, right? Which is a little bit concerning, of course. The updated model shows something very, very similar. This was updated in 2020. The MIT scientists have been hard at work making sure that limits to growth, the original model was still somewhat accurate. And what you see today in 2020 is a forecasted drop in industrial output and food output, pollution, et cetera, et cetera. So resources such as fresh water and fresh air have been in decline since the 70s, right? So that's limits to growth, right? One other aspect to this that I thought would be interesting to think about was agent-based modeling, right? Which is really kind of an organic approach to systems modeling that basically says each individual component or actor in a system can be modeled as operating independent of the other, but within a set of parameters that do interact with each other and have impact on each other. So agent-based modeling is a computational model for simulating the actions and interactions of autonomous agents, both individual or collective entities, such as organizations and groups. It's in order to understand the behavior of a system and what governs its outcomes that we use agent-based modeling, which is, of course, modeled in the time domain, right? It combines elements of game theory, complex systems, emergence, computational sociology, multi-agent systems, and evolutionary programming. Monte Carlo methods are used to understand the stochasticity of these models. And the model I would like to use today, for a few moments at least, is the model called NetLogo. So let me bring in some NetLogo simulations, right? This one in particular is known as the, why can't I get rid of this? Control Shift A, there you go. So this is the wolf, sheep, grass model, right? So what does this mean? It basically is a simulation of 3 basic elements in a fixed finite ecosystem, okay? It's closed as a closed system. Each component, the sheep, the wolves, and the grass, all operate independently of each other. However, one is consumed often by the other, right? So the sheep eat the grass, right? The wolves eat the sheep. If you run out of grass, you run out of sheep, you run out of wolves. It's that simple, right? But so each has their own reproduction rate, each has their own rate of energy consumption, and each has their own initial state. So I'm going to start with an initial state of roughly 100 sheep, 87 wolves, with relatively low reproduction rates for the sheep and the wolves, and also some relatives, I guess, pretty robust gains from food for both the sheep and the wolves, as you can see here, of 15 and 20. These sliders can be adjusted, but let's take a look to see what would happen if we model this over any period of time. So that's the initial state. Let's hit go. All right, what you can see immediately is the grass plummets pretty dramatically and then picks up. The sheep peak at about 500 or so, no, 700, and then drop off. Shortly thereafter, the wolves drop off to near zero. After that happens, the sheep population explodes. It's worth noting that the grass never really goes away completely. At least that's the way this is coded. So you will never have a complete denuded landscape. The grass always hits some minimal level and then levels off, right? As you can see in this model, the wolves have already died off. There are no more wolves anymore. The sheep are slowly hitting their new steady state, which isn't 100. It's closer to, I guess we're seeing about 700 or so. The wolves are gone. The sheep have leveled off at 700, and the grass has leveled off at about 40 to 50. So what happens if the sheep, what can we do? Let's do slower grass regrowth time. So instead of 51, let's make it take longer, let's say 87, right? So now it's taking much longer to grow grass. You'll notice an immediate plummeting, right? So where we used to have 1,400 sheep at the peak, 700 sheep at the last steady state, we're now closer to 300 or so. So the longer the grass takes to grow, the fewer sheep you can support in the landscape. So what if we shortened the grass regrowth time so it grows much, much faster? What happens almost immediately is that the sheep explode in value, right? We have no natural predators here. The wolves are gone. And they will hit a new steady state. You'll notice that the grass, even though it's growing faster, never really achieves a very high level of grassiness, if you want to use that word, because the sheep are eating them faster, eating the grass faster than it can replenish itself. So the sheep again have an overshoot condition here. We saw overshoot conditions here and here and here as well. So the sheep have this tendency to overshoot their environment and then hit a new steady state. This is the nature of systems. This is possibly what the human population is also going through. So we need to think seriously about our environment, how we're using these natural resources, what those limits to growth are, and how we can better manage if there is an overshoot, how we can better manage it, because what this will lead to is mass migrations, potentially mass starvations if we're not careful. But I mean, obviously here, the sheep went from 1,400 to 700 to 400, now up to 3,200. Imagine that for a human population, that would be extremely troubling and disturbing, and it would cause probably something close to societal collapse. So this is an interesting model. If you're interested in using something like this, you can certainly look up NetLogo at Northwestern University. There's a web page where you can literally download the application, look under various different models. I was looking under the biological models because I thought this was quite interesting to see the interrelationship between sheep and wolves and grass. You know, three elements: Our world is far, far more complex, and we're hoping capitalism will take care of all this. But as you know, right, capitalism is based on linear relationships, and biology is based on exponential. With that, I will let you to it, and good luck with your deep dive into systems.